in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
Feel like we a type of tide we ain't never been. I can't see the light at the end of the tunnel yet. Feel like I ain't made for this, I ain't built to win. Not mature enough, I ain't pure enough to be heaven sent or be militant, nah. Feel like I ain't Dr. King of another heaven yet. So don't look to me, I can't carry it. Man, I'm probably closer to a scary yet. Fighting out my fears, I still carry tears. Looking for a home for 400 years. So inside my bones, Lord, I gotta know if I'm by myself that I'm not alone. Looking at my feet, standing on the shoulders of my father's dreams and my mama's groans. Product of their hopes, they could never reach. Only see it looking through a telescope. Lord, I gotta know if we gotta go, that you got our feet. Help us keep the course that you gonna bring. Every single force, every angel in the sky making noise, every man, woman, child, every source all around the world, lifting every
voice and sing till earth and heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought.
is the time. Now is the time. Now is the time. The fierce urgency of now. What a powerful phrase. Urgency means it's right now. It's immediate. It's insistent. You can't ignore it. But it's a fierce urgency. It grips you. You can't breathe until you do something about it. When? Not later, not soon, but now. The fierce urgency of now. Now, that was 1963, more than half a century ago. But in many ways, we could still say that when it comes to racial justice in America, and especially the church, we need to respond to the fierce urgency of now.
Well, good evening, church. Welcome to our MLK special edition of Culture Night. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Pastor Tyler. I serve as the lead pastor here at All Nations Worship Assembly of Pensacola, Florida. And I am excited to welcome you into a special edition of Culture Night. Here at Convo, we do three things. We help people to find family, discover purpose, and change the world. And I want you to type it in the comments, especially if you are a member and partner of Onward Pensacola. Type change the world in the comments. We are going to be doing a little bit of that tonight. And I have a special guest. Normally we pull from people within. Dr. Jemar Tisby is joining us. He is a New York Times bestselling author of a book every single Christian should read, The Color of Compromise. Go ahead and put that up, Jemar, because I know you got that. I know you got that. He is also the author of How to Fight Racism. Go ahead, I'm giving you a chance to pull that one up. And he is the author of the How to Fight Racism Young Readers Edition, which I got a copy of.
Got your book too. Double trouble. Watch it.
Look, man, I'm telling you, Jemar is a resource, and he is also the founder of an organization that I'm proud to be a part of called The Witness. He and I host a podcast together called Pass the Mic. Did you just throw up a... You gonna get us?
I didn't know we were doing that. Are we doing that in the tutu?
You gonna get us banned from Facebook, man. They're gonna be like, I knew someone was off about this church. Listen,
gang symbols.
Dr. Tisby, thank you so much for joining us, brother. This means so much that you would hop in on MLK Day.
Bruh, say less. It was a privilege. It's a privilege. What's up? I'm a family. I am rooting for y'all. I am praying for y'all. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to join you for this very special occasion. Tyler and I are already hyped. It's going to be a good conversation.
We are. Look, we're talking about one of our favorite topics, which is Black Christian legacy, specifically in the life and the mission and the acts of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So happy MLK Day, everyone. Let's get right into it. And I want you to lean in because we're going to do some background, but then we're really going to get deep into what MLK's legacy should mean for the church in 2022. And I want to actually start with how we remember MLK. Many of us, I actually remember Taylor Branch, Dr. Taylor Branch, the historian. I remember him talking about how when it comes to race, it's easy for people in the majority culture to misremember history and to turn it upside down. And that was such a visceral image that we turn and invert history and make it seem like people were loved and accepted and everything wasn't as bad. Jemar, let's turn history right side up and let's get into how King was actually received in his time and how long it took for King to be considered this beloved figure. There's so many people posting quotes today, talking about how great King is, sharing the I Have a Dream speech. But was King that popular, and were his ideas and ideals that accepted in his time?
So let's talk about the reception of King in his lifetime. So this is even before he's killed. I just want to read to you a paragraph from this. This is a great book. I didn't write this one. More Beautiful and Terrible History, the Uses and Misuses of Civil Rights History by Jean Theoharis. This is what she writes. She says, arguably beginning when President Ronald Reagan signed the bill in 1983 to make the third Monday of January a federal holiday for Martin Luther King Jr., the political uses, talking about memory, right?
Yes.
The political uses of memorializing the movement took on heightened possibility as a national narrative. So she's saying, political figures now recognize we can use King's legacy as part of our national narrative of progress. And then she goes on to say, 15 years of opposition to the holiday gave way to recognizing its political utility. I'll say that again, its political utility. The civil rights movement became a way for the nation to feel good about its progress. And King's legacy became enshrined in his dream speech. As we know, that wasn't the only speech he gave. His popularity expanded. So by 1987, 76% of Americans held a favorable opinion of the civil rights leader. Almost the reverse of his popularity at the end of his life. In 1966, only 28% of Americans had a favorable opinion of him. 1966, 2 years before he's assassinated, only 28% of Americans had a favorable opinion of him. Isn't that interesting? This man who we now celebrate. And by the way, you probably noted that she said after 15 years of opposition, and that's literal because the first legislation proposed to make an MLK holiday was in 1968. The same
The
year
year
he
he was
was assassinated.
assassinated. Yep.
So for a decade and a half, they could not muster the popularity or the political will to make MLK Day a holiday. By the way, the spearhead of that effort was none other than Coretta Scott King. Give her her roses. It's
Yes.
because of Coretta Scott King that we have all of his collected speeches and writings and memorabilia. She had the foresight and the insight to make sure that she collected her husband's works for posterity, and also was key in pushing the MLK Day to become a federal holiday. And I'll end with a brief story around his assassination. And as you and I, Tyler, always say, he was killed. He didn't die.
Yes. Yes.
He was killed. It was a violent death. And I wrote about this in my first book, The Color of Compromise. There was a Black man named Dolphus Weary, who in 1968 was an undergraduate student at a white evangelical college. He grew up in Mississippi. He had been persuaded to go to this school on the West Coast by all these promises of racial progress and inclusion and all this stuff. So he said, let me give it a shot. Played on the basketball team, was a popular student there. On the day King was assassinated, Dolphus Weary heard about it over the radio. And the first word he got was simply that King had been shot. It didn't say whether he lived or died.
Mm-hmm.
Well, hours later, it comes back, King, in fact, had been killed. And so while Dolphus Weary is in there questioning reality and devastated at the death of this civil rights leader, outside of his room and down the hallway in his dorm, which is filled with white people, he hears cheers of celebration. His fellow white classmates laughing and joking and celebrating the fact that King had been killed. So we want to talk about the real King. We want to talk about MLK in his day. Those are some of the data points and realities that give us a sense of how unpopular fighting racism has always been.
I want to lean into this right now, because the reason why we're starting here is because it's essential for us not to have rose-colored glasses and this idea in our hearts that fighting for truth or justice, or even this entire enterprise, this catch-all that we call changing the world, is something that is going to be accepted and received well by people. Before you step out and say something, you just should prepare yourself that you're going to be maligned for speaking the truth. And this is important because it connects to the Black Christian legacy. And I want to talk a little bit about this, Jemar. We do so much work talking about Black Christians and the importance of Black Christians in history and also in the present. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important for us to center and also to remember Black Christian history, and for Black Christians to remember our own history within the context of being resisted, but still standing up in the midst of that resistance?
Absolutely. I think that the Black church as a tradition and an institution is, it's going to sound funny, the most American, truly American institution in terms of the ideals that this nation likes to espouse.
Right.
So the Black church tradition stands as the clearest contrast to white supremacy in the US, which means everything that white supremacy stands for, the Black church stands against in so many ways.
Yes.
Authoritarianism, exclusivity, wealth hoarding, racism, obviously.
Yes.
And so in that way, the Black church and individuals in the tradition have stood up for multiracial democracy, inclusivity, justice, and equity. Now, obviously, not perfectly. We can go through many examples
of course,
of that. But here's the thing. Here's what I get worked up about, Tyler. Even today, activists like to criticize others for quoting King without adopting his politics.
Mm-hmm.
But we also need to realize that we can co-opt King without understanding his Christianity.
Talk about
Like,
it. Let's go. Talk about it. That's provocative, man.
we can't champion King's political and social and economic ideas without understanding the roots of that in his faith.
Yes.
I mean, King was a son of the Black church through and through. Daddy King was prominent not only in Atlanta, which is, already a prominent city, but in the National Baptist Convention itself. The president of the NBC, Joseph Jackson Jr., who would later be at loggerheads with King Jr., stayed at their house when King was growing up. He was dyed in the wool through and through. His beautiful oratory, Black church.
Yes.
He grew up listening to Black preachers, right? Like, listen to the end of every talk he gives. I don't care if it's at the United Nations or in a church. It's sermonic, and especially the ending, right? You could dissect it all, the cadence, the repetition, all of it, right? That's Black church. And the way he applied the Bible and his understanding of scripture to social and political and economic problems. You simply cannot understand King's activism without understanding King's faith.
Yes.
But where is that?
Come on.
So here's what would be radical for some people, right? A lot of people like to quote King on like democratic socialism, on guaranteed income, guaranteed jobs, and be like, that's the King nobody likes to quote. But what about, here's what'll get some people. What about the fact that King got more dedicated to nonviolence throughout his life and not less? What about the fact that King wore suits and had his hair cropped short? Who knows if he would have maintained that? But respectability politics, right? A lot of people would, in King's day, y'all not ready for this.
Come on. No, it's true. It's the truth.
Even Black people were like, King is Uncle Tom. King has sold out. King is working with the white people too much.
Which is so important because the reason why we're bringing that up is because it is important for us to understand that, again, don't misremember history. You are not doing anybody a favor by misremembering history. I know sometimes what many of us like to think is that by misremembering history, we're keeping peace. You are not keeping peace by misremembering history. And that includes our own history, which is not every Black church and Black pastor and Black leader was a fan of King in his day. As a matter of fact, very many of them were not fans of King.
Right. Yes.
So many Black churches did not stand on the side of justice. So don't think that just because we're a Black church or there's a consideration of justice and we talk about it, that we're always standing on the side of justice. And that's a biblical concept, right? The idea of justice for all, the idea of loving God first with all heart, mind, soul, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourselves, which properly interpreted means loving the systems and the policies that give our neighbor an opportunity to flourish. That is what it means to change the world. If you're going to love your neighbor, that means that you must advocate on behalf of them so that they have an opportunity, they have a chance, they have the ability to flourish as God has created them to, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us. And so, Jemar, you're touching on so many different things. When you think about how now Dr. King is often quoted and talked about and discussed, it's clear you're trying to connect some dots here, connect some dots that we've missed, connect some dots that we might not be aware of. Talk a little bit about what King can teach, first of all, us as Black Christians, right? Then we're going to bring other people into this, but first, us as Black Christians, what King can teach us about standing up for truth, righteousness, justice in a world that does not want to hear it, because I think that's applicable in 2022.
Here's some of the things that I've gleaned from King in my own practice. Number one, he was an incredibly integrative thinker. I read some of King's speeches where he name drops like Nietzsche and Hegel and Schleiermacher and others.
Yeah,
It's
William Cullen
wild,
Bryant and James
you
Russell
know.
Lowell. Yeah, exactly.
And I'm like, you like, did his audience rock with it? Like that would have flown right over my head. And yet he was able to take parts of his education which drew on like European philosophers and integrate that with his understanding of Christianity and justice, all from a Black perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So King was a wonderful model of being intellectually curious, learning and taking from wherever he found something helpful, and then putting that into a mix that could be helpful for pursuing freedom and changing the world. I thought that was
I think, yeah, I really want to say something to that. I'm glad you brought that up, because I think it's really important for us as believers, especially within the Black Christian context, to recognize that everywhere we go and everything that we encounter and experience is part of our spiritual formation. It is part of our discipleship, right? So I know some people are thinking, well, I'm not an activist. I've got a regular 9-to-5 job. No, that's actually a part of how you love your neighbor, like what you do in your 9-to-5 job, like how your children interact with culture publicly. All of these things are combined together, and God intends to use them. So I'm glad you brought up the integration, because so often we're trying to separate, what happens on Sunday morning from what happens Monday through Saturday. Right, and God is saying, no, all of this together is a part of your growth, your development, and also how you love people well.
Which is like another underappreciated aspect of King. First of all, the man was brilliant. He started at Morehouse College when he was 15 years old. 15 years old.
Yep.
And he would have, if he had been able to map out his life, he felt a strong pull toward a life of the mind, and would have loved to be a local church pastor who did a lot of scholarly research and wrote books. He just had a brilliant mind like this, right? That's one of the underappreciated aspects of King. One of the other lessons I learned from King is that pursuing racial justice, especially publicly, is never going to be popular, even with your own people.
Mm-hmm.
So we've touched on this earlier. King was not universally loved even by Black people and other Black Christians. So there were other Black Christians who thought his approach was too militant,
right?
Thought it was too confrontational. I mentioned Joseph H. Jackson before. He stood directly opposed to King. And because of it, King had, along with some other ministers, in 1962, left to form the Progressive National Baptist Convention so they could more openly pursue these justice issues, right? So, and I got this from another pastor, C.J. Rhodes, down in Jackson, Mississippi, at the historic Mount Elm Baptist Church. He's like, you can't pursue social justice as a church growth strategy. That one got me. Because I'm like, what all these young Black folks are looking for is a Black church that's involved in the struggle, a Black church that's on the front lines, right? So if you want to bring in young people, and I do think that's true, right? But it was also a sobering reminder from Rev Rhodes that it's never going to, first of all, that should never be the motivation.
Right. Mm-hmm.
We pursue justice for love of neighbor, not to get more butts in seats.
Yes.
And then secondly, as we look at the example of King, there's no guarantee that people are going to rock with you, because even with if they agree with you on like the goal, the overarching goal, there's going to be lots of arguments about the method and about the strategy. Right. So those are a couple things.
I love that you mentioned that, because I think it really touches on what we talk about when we say, carrying your cross, right? Picking up your cross, right? Like, let him deny himself, right? And take up his cross and follow me. That's the call of Jesus. And part of that is a call for us to not necessarily be popular people who are always liked by society and always applauded, even by other factions and sections of the church. But I want to pull on that thread a little bit. Why isn't it popular? I mean, you think about it, in 2020, Jemar, we had the racial justice uprisings, we had all this. And I think for some believers, there's one group of believers that will probably be watching saying, why are we talking about this? What does this accomplish? But then there's another group that says, oh, everyone's on board with this. Look at how many people march in the streets. Locally, if you're in Pensacola, look at how many people went to the graffiti bridge. Like, look at how many people held up signs. Look at how many people applauded. Look at how many people showed up for the cause of justice. Why is it not popular? Why isn't it popular in our day, Jemar?
So I think two
I'm
reasons
setting you
come
up.
to mind.
I'm alley-ooping Jemar. Okay, this is what you do.
And if I don't get it, because I know you got thoughts on it too, and I want to hear your thoughts, but two things come to mind. It's not popular because it's incredibly costly and integrity is hard. It's incredibly costly and integrity is hard. So it's incredibly costly. If we look at MLK himself, it literally cost him his life. But even before he was assassinated, it cost him his health, so that in the autopsy, the 39-year-old king who had just been killed, the doctor said he had the heart of a man twice his age. So the stress of that life, and we know this, right, as people even concerned about racial justice, the sleepless nights, the high blood pressure, the anxiety, all of that takes a toll. So it's costly in terms of our physical and mental health. It's costly socially and in terms of our community. So you can get kicked out of your church, you can be ostracized by family and friends, you can lose money. I was just talking to another Black guy who's focused on sort of racial justice and whatnot, and we were like going back and forth the speaking events, the invitations that had been canceled because we took a stand on, and y'all, this is basic stuff. Like, we're just like, don't kill us, maybe under the name of a badge.
Yes.
Wild, right? And it's costly even then, right? So it's not something that people want to undertake, because when you really get into it, it's painful. The second thing is integrity is hard. So what's so interesting about King is his courage to follow where his convictions led him.
Come on, talk about that.
So what began initially with the Montgomery bus boycott as a simple effort to desegregate public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama, he used those same principles of nonviolence and treating people right, and look where it led him. One of the most unpopular places it led him was to oppose the war in Vietnam.
Right, yeah.
And even Black folks were like, look, don't do this. That's going to be too much heat. That's going to be too much smoke. Because war in the US has always been seen as righteous. It's always been seen as patriotic. There's no higher service one can render than to become a soldier and go overseas and defend democracy and defend America, right? So coming out against Vietnam, but King followed where his convictions led. He said, if we're on the side of the oppressed, he said, if I'm nonviolent, he said, if we need to redistribute wealth, then we can't be spending all this money on a war. And so came out and publicly opposed the Vietnam War. And it was in that context that he became even more unpopular, right? So when I say integrity is hard, it's like we can't be sort of pursuing righteousness in this one area and not see the implications both for that particular area, racial justice, as well as other areas as well. So
yeah, that's so true, man. I put on my pastoral hat as I think about this, man, and obviously in talking to our church, like, I think it's important for us to acknowledge that the gospel is a narrow road. Few people find it. These are the words of Jesus. The broad road leads to destruction, and the broad road, what often destroys us is the same thing that comforts us. What often destroys us is the same thing that desensitizes us. And so I think many of us have lived in a culture and lived in a time period where we have been desensitized to the violation of our neighbors and fellow image bearers. And so it is radical for us to turn on our pain sensors again, to activate nerves that have been dormant, and to say, it hurts me to see my neighbor violated. It hurts me to see my child violated and talked about in a bigoted or discriminatory way. It hurts me to see xenophobia. It hurts me to see these things. And as a result, many of us will feel a certain type of pain that we haven't felt, maybe ever, because finally the pain sensors that even in many cases the American church and the evangelical movements have turned off, because they said the only thing that matters is your spirit, not your body. The only thing that matters is salvation of the soul, not salvation of the body, not protection of your lived experience. And so when it turns back on and we start to read the prophets of old, when it turns back on and we open up Amos, when it turns back on and we open up Micah, when it turns back on and we see the fully orbed nature of how Jesus approaches those who are being marginalized, there's a little bit of discomfort that comes with that. And so many times we don't understand that we're being desensitized. And so this is designed in many cases to wake you up. It's a narrow road. It's not going to be popular because justice is always going to cost you something. It will always cost you something. And so as a result, the question is, are we willing to be discomfited? Are we willing to be, as King would say, maladjusted, right? Maladjusted, to step away from desensitization and step away from the things that would destroy us and say we need a better community. I also want to say, I think it's important to understand that I was actually having this conversation with a group of people at an Episcopal church on Saturday, and we were talking and someone said, I can't imagine that we just need to get back to teaching people and telling them, that we all come from the same place. We're all humans, right? And while I understood his point and I said, absolutely, I completely hear what you're saying. But the crux in the 1800s leading up to the 1900s, it was common for people to think that us as people of color, us as people with darker skin, were inferior. That's no longer common. It's no longer accepted to believe and think these things. Now the crux and the challenge, the thing that brings about the pain point, is power. It's privilege. Because over the course of centuries, what have we seen? Unjust gain. And over the course of unjust gain and unjust influence, because one group or many groups have been placed to the side and other groups have been given power and influence and control, now to walk in justice, you have to relinquish some of your power.
Wow.
To walk the gospel, you have to actually relinquish some of the things that will make you propped up and keep you in control. So now to walk in the pathway of Jesus, the narrow road, you have to say no to some things that it's easy for you to say yes to. And so now the question is, are we actually able to give up some of the things? And this is what Jesus says. Hey, what good is it for you to gain the world and lose your soul? You want to save your life? You're going to lose it. You willing to lose your life? Okay, you'll find it. It's the paradox. Okay, the last shall be first, the first shall be last. We're like, what? Oh, you meant that literally? Like, I think sometimes we need to be like, oh, snap, this is literal. Okay, so sometimes we have to give up. And I think many of us don't conceive of that in a church culture and in a American church context that caters to everything that we want, caters to everything that we desire. No, the gospel, following Jesus, it's a narrow road.
King spoke about that in his last years. He came to a greater and greater realization of that. And he literally used the phrase restructuring the whole of American society.
Yeah.
Restructuring the whole of American society, a lot of which was around the redistribution of wealth. And he was incensed. He was absolutely angered by the fact that we live in the wealthiest nation in the world and we still have any poor people whatsoever.
Yeah.
And went through and said, if we can spend this much on putting a man on the moon, if we can spend this much on wars, it would still actually cost less to give people a guaranteed annual income and make sure that everyone had food on their table, which, aside from the politics and the policy of it all, what I think he's saying is, what can we do as a society to lift people out of survival mode and move them into flourishing mode?
Yes.
Like that's a very Christian biblical concept. Like people, there are so many people where I am who are so poor, they can't, they hardly have any bandwidth for
Right.
activism,
Right.
let alone what we were created to do, like creating
Right.
culture,
Right.
works of art and poetry and writing and taking photographs and all of these beautiful things that humans were made to do. They have no bandwidth for that.
Yeah.
So King was radical in the sense that he said, we often, here's another thing, we look at his I Have a Dream speech and the dream portion.
Right.
And we get mad that people sort of misappropriate those quotes. People who stand against everything else King stood for, but will use that quote, I have a dream.
Sure.
But we also, I think subtly, Black folks and church folks think, well, that dream is like, it's not that powerful. It's kind of pie in the sky. It's like,
right. Of course, absolutely.
Here's what I think. King dared to dream. King dared to envision a different reality. Is what we often refer to from Walter Brueggemann, prophetic imagination.
Yes.
And prophetic imagination requires an incredible moral creativity to rethink the very structures that we take for granted in society, from capitalism to militarism to racism,
to housing, to healthcare, right? To
all
economics, education, all of it.
So the dream is only possible with the restructuring of the whole of American society, which is why it's hard. Most of us don't even imagine or dream that way. And if we do, I'll just say, this is one of the things that's gripping to me about history. The same kind of rejection King faced in his lifetime, we can look at people now who face that same kind of rejection, and we're like, they're too much.
Right,
too
right.
radical.
Of course,
whatever,
of course.
Right?
Yeah.
Like Bree Newsom climbing on a flagpole in South Carolina and getting arrested. You know, Reverend Dr. William Barber going to the Capitol and getting arrested, reviving the Poor People's Campaign. People who are, you know, going to great lengths to abolish the death penalty and reimagine criminal justice. And we just think they're like, that's them. You know, they're way out there. They super saved. They're super activists, right? That's how people view King. So if we want to walk in the legacy of King, guess how people are going to view us now? That's all I'm saying.
I love that, you know, and I want to, before we close out, I do want to bring attention, not just to the external King, but also to the internal King, because one of the other parts of the Black Christian legacy that I think is important to understand is that we believe in holistic discipleship, a holistic embodied theology. And so it's my conviction that we're not just people who change the world out in the world and in the community, but also that we are changed people, right? So it's not just, we can't change others if we ourselves are not changed. And really, we don't do the changing, right? It's only the Spirit of God that does the changing. But here's what I love about King, man. I love reading about King's quiet, private moments. And it reminds me of just so many people, not just in my faith journey, but also people within our church context who have private lives of devotion with the Lord, who in times of struggle turn on the old hymns, who in times of pain are on their knees before God, who cry in their, what we call the prayer closet, who cry out to God for change and cry out to God for relief. You know, talk a little bit about King's quiet moments, man, like, because I think it's important for us to hear that, you know, King wasn't just leading without a life of devotion. No, he wasn't a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination, but he wasn't leading out in public without a life that didn't say, like, I'm going to actually have to pray. I'm going to actually have to hear the voice of God. And I think sometimes we're so out in the external that we forget we have to lead internal lives of control, internal lives of discipline, and internal lives of devotion to the Lord.
So I think that's critically important. And what comes to mind are two aspects of King's life. One, he underwent a crisis of faith very early on during the Montgomery bus boycott. He was like a month into it, had already been getting death threats and phone calls. And one particular night, he'd gotten back late from an organizing meeting, couldn't sleep, got another phone call threatening him and his family, which is what really disturbed him, and basically broke down in his at his kitchen table and was like, God, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can. I mean, can you imagine like a literal death threats, right? And so he writes about it later as when his faith became real to him. And I think that's powerful because there's a scenario in which Martin Luther King Jr., beautifully eloquent, highly educated, son of a prominent Black Baptist preacher, could have gone on to a very stable, popular ministry without much risk.
Prodigious gifts too. I mean, he would have been popular no matter what.
Yeah, he would have quickly gotten invitations to some of the most prominent pulpits in the nation. And perhaps in another scenario, that's the way he goes. But I think at that kitchen table moment, all the way back, I believe this is January 5th, 1956, he realizes, oh, Jesus really meant what he said. And if I really mean what I say in terms of calling myself a Christ follower, then this is what I must do. And I think in that moment, without knowing the full implications, he realized that his life was going to take a dramatically different course. But he stuck with it. He took that narrow road. The second thing that comes to mind in terms of King's like devotional practice and inner life, he had around him a tight-knit community of people, mostly within the SELC, who walked with him. You can't find a picture of King out there marching or doing activism without this familiar cast of characters, from Ralph Abernathy to Fred Shuttlesworth to Ella Baker for a time. You know, he had people around him who understood the mission, who supported him, who enabled and empowered him in it. So he wasn't going it alone.
That's good.
And I think that is critical in our day and age, where it's so easy, especially because we have this illusion of connectedness through a screen with other people and with the broader movement. Like King always had a community, whether that was the broader Black church, whether that was Ebenezer Baptist Church, or the folks he was with it. I felt a similar kind of kinship and connection with folks like you at the Witness. You know, like you cannot engage in this struggle without people who understand, can support, and can even laugh with you. I think another aspect of King's private life, he loved to laugh.
Yes, he did. I love the pictures of him smiling. I love those pictures.
Yes. So those are some things that are vital. And the last thing I'll say is we often measure progress by external change. I think in God's economy, God is measuring progress in justice by the internal change as well. So it's not just how we change the world, but how the movement changes us. And that's just as critical in God's eyes as moving the needle on changing a law or a policy.
You know, and I want to bring this up again, putting on my pastoral hat to Alma Pensacola. This is why we do this, right? We do this because our movement towards justice and towards a more equitable world will not just change our community and change Pensacola, it will change us in pursuit of that. And in pursuit of that, by doing the work, by being the hands and the feet of Jesus, what happens? We ourselves are transformed and changed. I want to talk about that practical element as we close, Jemar. I know people might be listening and they're, wow, this is provocative. This is interesting. I didn't know this, or maybe I did know this, but I didn't know the extent of it. What do I do with it? You know, how would you recommend that people follow in King's legacy, the Black Christian legacy? Give Anwa Pensacola some encouragement and some advice on how we can be people who follow in the fully orbed vision of eternal transformation, internal devotion to God, and also external calls for love and justice and equity, even in our own communities. What should we do?
The easiest thing you can do is pick up this book, Fight Racism.
The how-to. I'm gonna hold up the young readers just in case.
And the
missed it
Young Readers
earlier.
Edition. I mean, literally trying to answer this question through a whole book, but I'll use the framework I introduced in the book, the arc of racial justice, awareness, relationships, commitment. So on the awareness level, like actually read full-length works by King, not just the quotes. Even us as Black Christian folks, we tend to know the King that makes the headlines or the King that gets quoted. Read or listen to that you recorded Letter from Birmingham Jail, right?
Absolutely,
Like
absolutely.
go
Shameless
through that
plug.
whole thing annually, like easily, twice annually. Read his last book, Where Do We Go From Here, which is about fleshing out the dream and more than just a soundbite, right? There are lots of collected works. There are lots of great biographies on King. You mentioned Taylor Branch, that's a 3-volume biography. Yes. You don't have to do one, but you know, learn about the actual life and legacy of King. Along those same lines of awareness building, think about how you might teach the young people in your life. Yes. So this morning with my son, who's 11, we watched this sort of like 10-minute animated video about King's life. And then we listened to a portion of the I Have a Dream speech, and we talked about all of it, right? And I don't know what's going to stick or not, but it's helpful to let our young people know what has happened in the past and what we're still fighting for in the present. So that's awareness. Relationships. For Black folks, I think it is being very intentional about surrounding ourselves with the people we want to emulate, particularly when it comes to justice. So who are the people doing work right now that you admire, and how can you get more access to them or people like them? This can be local, this could be other pastors, this could be a fellowship, this could be a book study, this could be on a national scale, people that you're following on social media or whose books you're reading, right? Like we need to surround ourselves with the people we want to become like. And also, as we were saying with King, you know, he always had a community to sort of support him in this very difficult work. So intentionally cultivating those communities that can support us in this work of justice, racial justice. And then lastly, on the commitment aspect, which doesn't mean just staying the course, which obviously we need to, it means committing to changing the systems and the structures. Yeah. So at this point, and you might have more fine-grained action items here, but at the very front edge of the racial justice struggle is the struggle for voting rights. Yep. What we have to do at this point, it seems like the only recourse is to eliminate the filibuster or find a workaround to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Act passed and to protect at a federal level the right for all people to vote, because at the state level, it's already too late in a lot of places. They've been quietly, sometimes loudly working to put into place officials who will overturn legitimate election results. And so what that means is the legal levers of power are being stripped away. And if that happens, we will be looking at another era where demonstrations like that of the civil rights movement are necessary because there's no other option. In other words, we're going to be looking at marches in the streets. We're going to be looking at arrests. We're even going to be looking at brutality and death, because you can't use the established channels for redress. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's so good. I want to actually underscore a couple of the things that you said, because I think this is so good. Number one, on the awareness idea, what you said about talking to the young people in your life. I mean, especially if you're an adult, maybe you've lived through the civil rights movement, or maybe you've lived through some of the elements of the freedom struggle and the fight for integration. Please have conversations. You know, you don't always have to. I think sometimes like there's this idea that we have to come to the same conclusion and end up in the same place and always agree on tactics. That is not the case. But at least opening up the conversation creates a really healthy dialogue. We're a multi-generational church, and as a result, I think we need to have more multi-generational conversations about what this looks like and what this means for us and how this makes us feel. Liz, I'm going to tell you something
Those of us in our 20s and our 30s experienced 2020 and the racial justice uprisings of 2020 a lot different than everyone else did. And the reason is we saw people who look like us. We saw people who were in our age. We saw people who were in our station of life. Ahmaud Arbery was young. Trayvon Martin was young. Mike Brown was young. And so I think it's important for us, Breonna Taylor, young. It's important for us to have some sort of connection to what generations are talking. And then also an older generation for us to glean from your wisdom, your resilience, what kept you going. And again, even if we don't agree on the same tactics, the same principles, the same ideas, because we're going to have different perspectives, it's important for us to be in dialogue and conversation with each other. And then on the awareness point, please, we're in Pensacola, Florida. There is a rich history in Pensacola, Florida, especially as it relates to Black Pensacola. Do some research on Black Pensacola. If you don't do anything else, have a working knowledge of the history of Black Pensacola. You know, I talk about this all the time, how Pensacola used to be a majority Black city. What happened? Why did it happen? Why did Booker T. Washington at one point call us the model city for Black advancement? Why is that? Why was that a thing for us? And why is that no longer a thing for us, right? And being aware of that is extremely helpful. And then, you know, secondarily, when we talk about relationships, and I love what Jemar is talking about, connecting to people who do this work, there should at least be one space in your schedule for a commitment to a relationship or a community that is outside of your normal space, but beyond outside of your normal space, that is doing something to push the cause of justice and equity forward. You have to actually schedule it in. You know, I think sometimes we're like, oh, if something comes up, I'm ready. It's like, well, no, that actually has to be a part of your discipleship practice. So go to church on Sunday. You know, when we release the opportunity for you to join tribes here, small groups here, join a tribe, be involved in all that, serve, you know, volunteer, be a part of supernatural demonstration. All of that is phenomenal. We love that. And also part of your spiritual development and your discipleship and your formation is to you to be involved or volunteering with an organization locally that's going to help you have what we call in Onward's culture, city impact. Like what's actually changing a city? You know, maybe that's volunteer. Maybe that's being a part of PTA. You know, maybe that's being a part of Achieve Escambia. Maybe that's being a part of Brace. Maybe that's being a part of Truth for You. Maybe that's being a part of any of these local organizations that are actually giving you, There's Hope with Caleb Houston, giving you an opportunity to serve your local community and push justice and equity forward. And then let me say another thing finally, and then I'll let y'all go. As a pastor, read your Bible. Read the prophets. Like, read the Bible, please. Read Isaiah, please. Because I think sometimes we think these things are so against the gospel and the Christian message because we have not incorporated them in our devotional time and our internal time. So I just encourage you to make this also a part of your devotion as well, that maybe it's once a month or maybe it's once a week, you're actually able to read scriptures and portions of the prophets and allow that to change, allow the Holy Spirit to speak to you and to how that will change the way that you live. Okay. I'm off my soapbox. Jemar, how can people support you? Because you've given us so much time. I'm gonna hold it up one more again. Who is this for? When you talk about the Young Readers Edition, who is this for? Tell people who this is for.
Yeah. Ideal for kids ages 8 to 12, that 4th through 6th grade range, but honestly, it would be great for adults. So you can grab 2 copies for the adult and the young people in your life, or get the adult version and the young version and read through it together. Aside from that, I write most frequently at my newsletter, jemartisby.substack.com. You can subscribe for free, or if you want to support the work, you can become a paid subscriber, jemartisby.substack.com.
Awesome. We'll put that in the comments as well so that people can see that and support. And also, just another shameless plug, listen, download our podcast. Yes. Pass the mic. We do this on a weekly basis. So I know y'all are like, cool, this is a one-time thing. No, we do this every week. So subscribe to the podcast. It's Pass the Mic on wherever you listen to podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever it may be. Listen, Jemar, this has been incredible, man. Thank you so much for donating your time, giving it to us, and encouraging us as a local church to pursue the call of justice and to walk in the steps of Dr. King. I actually wanted to end by reading this quote where King in 1968 talks about why we shall overcome. I want to read this quote. He says, "We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future." He says, "We shall overcome because the Bible is right. You shall reap what you sow. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day when all God's children all over this nation, Black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we're free at last." Thank you, brother. I appreciate you. Thank y'all. This has been Culture Night. We love y'all. We'll see y'all next week.
And sing till love in heaven ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoice